There was no one left.
An entire village gone.
All right, let's dive right back into this explainer, picking up exactly where we left off. Today, we're doing the Anjikuni Lake Mystery Part 2, Inside the Investigation. We are leaving the campfire ghost stories and the weird science fiction rumors way behind us, and instead, we're opening up the actual, cold, hard case files from the 1930s. Now, if you remember from Part 1, we heard this super sensational tale of an entire Inuit village just vanishing into thin air on the icy shores of Anjikuni Lake. Well, now we're going inside the real investigation to find out exactly what happened when the authorities actually started asking questions. So, let's start with the bottom line. The definitive conclusion from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police was literally just 5 words. No foundation for this story. Boom, that was it. In 1931, Sergeant J. Nelson dismantled the entire vanishing village myth almost immediately. The RCMP didn't cover this up. They didn't treat it like an X-Files paranormal event. They simply looked into the claims, assessed the evidence, and firmly, completely shut the door on the idea that any mass disappearance ever happened. But, how did they figure that out so fast? Well, it comes down to a really swift, rigorous investigation by Sergeant Nelson. Stationed out in Manitoba, he didn't just guess what happened, he followed a super methodical process. Step 1, within a matter of days, he tracked down and interviewed the so-called star witness, fur trapper Joe Labelle. Step 2, over the next few weeks, Nelson meticulously reviewed the patrol records of the Mounties who had actually traveled through the Anjikuni Lake area in the autumn and winter of 1930. And Step 3, he cross-referenced all those logs with the testimony of Hudson's Bay Company traders, guys who actually knew the inland Inuit families intimately. And the result of all that digging? Every single family known to use that specific area was fully accounted for.
Now, here is where things get really interesting, especially when we look at our star witness, Joe Labelle. The legend always portrays this guy as some grizzled, seasoned Arctic veteran who knew the locals and just immediately sensed when something was horribly wrong. The reality? Actually, Labelle was a total rookie. Seriously, he was on his very first trapping license and was entirely new to the area. He simply did not know the land, he didn't know the culture, and he certainly didn't know the people he was looking at. He was completely an outsider who was just severely misinterpreting what he saw.
So how on earth did this hoax spread like wildfire? I mean, the story certainly didn't go viral because of Labelle's mundane official report to the police. No, it went viral because of a journalist named Emmett E. Kelleher. Picture this. It's January 1931, it's a super slow news month, and Kelleher decides to write a feature for the Halifax Herald. The catch? Kelleher had never even been to Anjikuni Lake. He hadn't even interviewed Labelle in person. He just took a brief, likely secondhand account and spun it into a sensational 13-paragraph yarn perfectly engineered to sell newspapers in the dead of winter. He completely fabricated the pots of leftover stew, the 30 missing residents, the abandoned rifles. All these juicy details designed purely to thrill, not to inform. And if you're looking for a smoking gun to prove this was a total media fabrication, look no further. The Halifax Herald published this highly dramatic photograph alongside Kelleher's article, and they captioned it as the abandoned camp at Anjikuni Lake, but it absolutely wasn't. Investigators very quickly identified the image as a decades-old stock photograph of an Inuit summer camp. They pulled it directly from government archives. It was taken way back in 1909 in a completely different region of the Arctic. There was zero photographic evidence of the quote-unquote vanished village, simply because the village didn't exist. To really grasp what our rookie trapper Labelle actually stumbled upon, we need to understand the true locals of the region, the Kivaldi Milt, who are also known as the Caribou Inuit. These were absolutely brilliant, inland-adapted Inuit bands. Unlike the coastal Inuit you might typically picture hunting seals on the ice, the Caribou Inuit lived far away from the ocean. Their entire subsistence, their economy, their calendar, their whole survival was completely tethered to the seasonal migrations of the buried-ground Barabittle. Because of that lifestyle, the very word village is completely wrong here. These ingenious people survived by staying highly mobile. They didn't build permanent stone or timber settlements. Instead, they used temporary, seasonal camps, setting up caribou skin tents in the summer and snow igloos in the winter. When the caribou herds shifted directions, the families had to pack up and follow them immediately. A location might be occupied for 3 weeks, completely abandoned for 10 months, and then casually reoccupied the next year. It was a fluid, dynamic way of life. When you map the myth against the reality, it all clears up beautifully. What looked like panicked abandonment to a total rookie was actually a highly sophisticated survival strategy. Remember the myth claiming they left behind pots of stew and half-mended clothes? The reality is they were caching heavy, non-essential domestic items to lighten their load while tracking the herds. They fully intended to come back and retrieve them next season. And what about the terrifying detail of the abandoned rifles? The reality is they took their good, lightweight hunting rifles with them and just safely stored their older, surplus, or broken firearms inside the tents. To anyone who actually understood the culture, this was a totally normal, highly organized seasonal move. Even the spookiest, most unsettling details have a perfectly logical explanation. Labelle claimed he found empty graves that had been deliberately dug up and desecrated by human hands. But here's the thing about the Arctic permafrost. It's impenetrable. The Caribou Inuit physically couldn't dig deep graves. So burials were actually shallow, surface-level stone mounds known as cairns. Over time, the harsh freeze-thaw cycles and those brutal Arctic winds naturally eroded and shifted the stones, which caused the cairns to collapse. So, to an untrained southern observer, natural weathering just looked like supernatural grave robbing.
And oh man, then there's the famous detail of the still smoldering cooking fire. Labelle's claim of finding a warm fire in a camp that had supposedly been abandoned for weeks is, quite frankly, physically impossible. But again, there is a totally rational explanation. It was a really common, widely understood practice in the Arctic for passing travelers, traders, or hunters from neighboring bands to use empty seasonal tents for a quick rest. They'd build a warm fire, warm up, and then move on. That is exactly why there were warm ashes. It wasn't some creepy glitch in the Matrix, it was just a passing traveler who stopped for a break.
So, an empty camp wasn't supernatural in the slightest. It was most likely an ordinary seasonal move. But, there are other real, heavily documented reasons an Inuit camp in 1930 might be empty. The families might have embarked on a massive 350-kilometer trek to the Hudson's Bay Company post at Eskimo Point just to trade furs for flour. Or, far more tragically, an empty camp might simply mean the people who used it did not survive the previous unforgiving winter.
And that brings us to the real history here. When we look closely, the true, quiet catastrophe of the Kivalliumut emerges. It wasn't aliens. It wasn't ghosts. It was devastating famine, as caribou populations crashed in the 1910s and 20s. It was a horrific tuberculosis epidemic, introduced by outsiders that absolutely hollowed out families in the 30s and 40s. And all of this culminated in the 1950s, when the federal government forced the relocation of surviving Inuit families entirely away from their traditional lands. That is the heavy, real history of Anjikuni Lake. But wait, if the RCMP completely debunked this sensational story back in 1931, why are we still talking about it? Well, the year 1959 changed everything. Almost 30 years after the fact, an American radio broadcaster and author named Frank Edwards dusted off this long-forgotten newspaper hoax and resurrected it in his best-selling book, Stranger Than Science. And you have to see how the lie mutated over the decades once it hit the paranormal circuit. It's wild. Edwards didn't just repeat the 1931 article. He piled on totally absurd details, inflating the camp's population to 1,000 people and suddenly adding mysterious blue UFO lights. By the 1960s, authors like Brad Steiger were throwing in missing internal organs. By the 1970s, writers were linking the whole thing to alien abductions and the Mary Celeste. Each author just copied the last guy, adding their own sci-fi twist to sell more books, completely burying the historical truth of the real people who lived there. Which brings us to a really powerful realization about this entire saga. There's a quote that says, "The lake is just water. The catastrophe is the story we told instead." I think this perfectly encapsulates how a settler society managed to manufacture a flashy, entertaining sci-fi mystery, mostly to avoid acknowledging the very real, very painful history of famine, disease, and relocation that was unfolding right in front of them during those exact same decades. So I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to ponder today. Why are we so eager to believe in ghosts, UFOs, and magically vanished villages, rather than face the real, sometimes difficult human stories of survival, culture, and tragedy? The actual, factual story of the Caribou Inuit is infinitely more fascinating, resilient, and important than some 1931 newspaper hoax could ever be. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I highly encourage you to look deeper into the true history of the Kivalliumut. See you next time.